So these are a couple of the areas of early development that learning depends on, and that can't happen really outside of the earliest relationships. And the point that I make here, and I'll try to make as we go through some of these, is that in order for the relationship between the adult caregiver, parent or other adult, and child to support the child's development in these areas, the parent has to be what I call emotionally available. What does that mean, emotionally available? How emotionally available are you feeling after having sat here all this time listening to me shoot my mouth off? What does it take to be emotionally available? You're worried about the bills you forgot to pay and that finance charge on your credit card and maybe the car accident that you didn't file the police report yet and how you're going to pay the tuition bill. And it's really hard. It's really hard to free up the presence in your thoughts to be with someone. Someone said, you said thoughtful attentiveness. Well, that's pretty hard to do. What does it cost you to be able to push aside all of your preoccupations? Where do you get what you need in order to be able to just be present? So we'll talk about attachment and self-regulation and mutual regulation as some of these early developmental events that occur in the context of the earliest relationships on which all subsequent learning really depends. And I hope as we go you can think about where the applications might be for your work in libraries. Now, here is Humphrey. And he's attaching himself to you. I'm looking at your faces, looking at Humphrey, and I can see some of you are attaching yourselves to him. And you don't even know Humphrey. He's probably 27 now. It's not even in color. But it's already happening. It's so powerful. And this attachment behavior is the visual gaze, way before words. Just this wonderful looking into the eyes. What do you think this behavior might be saying to a first-time parent? I need you. Other things you think this might say? Hold me. What else? Who are you? Wow. I think you'd all agree that he's saying a lot, right? And if you picture the process of becoming a parent, you're hungry. You are hungry for whatever your new baby is going to say to you. And for that whole period before there are words, you're hungry to understand your child's behavior, to tell you who you're going to be as a parent, how you're ever going to be a parent, and who your child is. So I said this approach is really recognizing that it is the child's behavior that is the parent's guide. And by remembering that, it allows us to take ourselves off of the expert pedestal or the advice-giving pedestal, to step off of that pedestal and to engage in what some of you referred to about how we learn, which is observation and sharing discovery. We can share the discovery together. So when a child is engaging in a behavior that might actually be problematic for you or for the parent, you have a choice between simply describing the behavior. I see your child's chewing the book. Or making an inference about it, which is, oh, he's showing us the earliest step in early literacy, is that he's falling in love with the book in his own way. Well, the parent might come from a culture where that is quite embarrassing, actually, for their child to be eating a book. And they might feel like you just didn't get them at all if you were celebrating it. So if we simply observe and describe the behavior and are really careful to distinguish for ourselves the difference between the description of the behavior and an inference we make about it. You all talked about being non-judgmental, and yet we can't help it. We have to make inferences about behavior. That's how we get to understanding. But if we can stop short of that, then we can ask the parents what their inference is. What do you think he's telling us while he's chewing on the corner of that book? I think he's hungry, or I think that's how he discovers the world, or I think he likes that book, or I think he's testing me and I need to discipline him. And then you'll know where you are with him. And you really can't get anywhere with anybody until you do know where you start. So attachment is very powerful, and you all know, of course, it's supported by these biological processes for mothers and babies. But what you might not know, and I told you I'd tell you about men later, is that men attach to through their neurohormones. So when a baby suckles a mother, oxytocin levels rise, and this may be a male fantasy, but I'm told that it's supposed to produce elation and euphoria in the mother. But men who've been present during the pregnancy and at birth will actually have, and this often makes men uncomfortable, so fortunately there aren't many here, prolactin levels, you know, prolactin is the hormone of nurturance. It will cause increasing levels of prolactin. Not to the point of lactating, usually. And declining levels of testosterone. You always have to tell them, don't worry, it's okay. It's all right. It's a good thing because it's nature's design to shift male behavior from procreating, again, right now, not a good idea, to nurturing. So if you have that expectant parent class and you can get fathers in and get them to read too. Another amazing experiment was someone actually put a microphone in the pregnant womb. I love looking at people's faces when I say that. Someone really did. And they were able to find out what fetuses in the last trimester can hear. Of course they hear the mother's voice, but they hear the father's voice from across the room too. So in our work in Touchpoints, we make these assumptions that all parents are the experts on their children and that all parents want to do well by their children. And this is always a challenge for people who have seen lots of families because they feel like, all? How can you say that, all? There are some parents who are so harsh or so rough. I would say 99.99%. If that makes you feel a little bit better? Even the parent who is physically abusive, slaps or spanks or smacks, the vast majority of those parents also want to do well by their child. That's a hard thing for anybody to handle. But they just lose it in that moment. They just lose it. The fact that they're rough and hurt their child, and trust me, in my work, I've seen plenty of cases that go over to the other side who are in the 0.01%. But the vast majority, even if they hit their child, want to do well by their child, and in that moment, they just lose it. They can't handle the child's behavior, they can't handle all of the other things that life is throwing with them at that moment, and there just isn't anything else that they can do. Has anybody in this room not lost their temper ever once? Now remember what I said about developmental crises as being an essential part of development? Well, this is why we see it with parents who nonetheless want to do well by their children. Because when a child is on the verge of a touch point, reaching for something new in their development, and then they fall apart, and become disorganized, what does the parent think? What's their way of explaining this temporary regression in the child's behavior? They blame themselves. First, they often ask, is my child sick? So they call the pediatrician, and the pediatrician says, oh no, don't worry, he'll grow out of it. Isn't that what pediatricians always say? And so when they hear the child's okay, then they blame themselves. So that, unfortunately, the fact that development proceeds by crises repeatedly challenges parents' confidence in themselves as parents. Repeatedly. Calls into question their basic underlying sense that I'm doing okay. I basically know more or less what I'm doing. And it's really hard to be a parent without being able to believe that, and yet in these periods of temporary regression, parents will. And I emphasize this because I think this is where you can be so helpful to parents. You all talked about temper tantrums. You all talked about negative behaviors in your presence. To understand that what it does to the parent is to undermine their belief in their competence as parents. And so our response has to be one that reaffirms parents' competence. We might even say, hey, it's great. Your kid's just reached this development milestone. He's having temper tantrums. I had to wait till my kid was 6 months older before my child had their first temper tantrum. Why not? Why not turn it into something that's really okay, that doesn't dismantle the parents' belief in themselves as parents? And lots of research has shown that parents actually do better. They're more effective as parents when they believe in themselves as parents, and they don't do as well. Now, people sometimes have trouble understanding that, but for those of you who have had adolescence, anybody here have had adolescence? Yeah. And the others of you were adolescents, and maybe you will someday have adolescence. You remember those moments where they put you between that rock and that hard place and you didn't know what the heck to do? It's the last minute and suddenly they want the car and their friends are watching and you don't know what to do. And if you had anticipated it and you knew what your response was going to be, you could sort of be authoritative and just say, no, actually you can't have the keys to the car or whatever. But because you're caught off guard and you're feeling disorganized and overwhelmed, you're kind of lost. And whatever you say, you do in some sort of unclear, half-baked way, and it's a problem. You can't be as effective when you're questioning yourselves. So for those of you who are still struggling with this, all parents are the experts. All parents want to do well by their child. The reason why I challenge you with that here is because it comes from the power of attachment. It's because attachment is not some touchy-feely thing that child psychiatrists like me like to romanticize about. It comes from the fact that most of the other mammals, young, are able to get up about 4 hours after they're born and find their way to the udder, right? And our young require the better part of a year before they develop the motor abilities to find their way to sustenance, to nourishing themselves. And so to compensate for that, and there's a reason why that happened, we put off our motor development so we can develop these other wonderful things like being able to enter into a relationship. It takes a lot of brain power to do that. Let's not waste that on learning to crawl until later on. But to compensate for that, attachment is nature's way of making sure that every baby makes their parents fall crazy in love with them, to make all kinds of sacrifices that they never dreamed they would be capable of doing. And that's a neurobiological process. And I should just add that this can happen for parents who adopt their children too, because although it's biological, we are affected biologically, neurobiologically by all of our experience throughout life. So that when we adopt, we still have other opportunities to have our neurohormones stimulated as we fall in love with the child that we've adopted. Now, there's one other reason for focusing on attachment, which is that, remember how I said some of you were starting to attach yourselves to Humphrey too? You just picture him looking into your eyes. He's not even your child. Have you ever had the experience of falling in love with someone else's child? In your libraries? Has that ever happened to you? I see some heads nodding. I think that that's the power of attachment. I fall in love with lots of other people's children. It's so powerful. How could it possibly discriminate just for our own biological children? And as a result of the power of attachment that leads us to fall in love not just with our biological children, but with other people's children too, something predictable but disturbing occurs, which is that particularly when a child is distressed or does not appear to be thriving, we are stimulated by our attachment to that child who isn't even ours to want to rescue her from that bad parent who isn't doing as good a job we would do if that child were ours. So I wonder if any of you have never experienced this phenomenon of competitive attachment, or Brazelton calls it gatekeeping, or Ron Lally calls it protective urges. Mothers and fathers compete with each other about who's right, who knows what the child needs, who's the best parent. Parents and mother-in-laws compete. Parents and teachers compete. Parents and pediatricians compete. And there's a lot of unnecessary negative energy that gets stirred up this way. But I think there is a solution if you encounter this in your work, whether it's between you and a parent, or maybe between you and another colleague. If I were with that child right now, I'd know what to do, and that child wouldn't be crying. And it's to recognize that the competitive feelings come from the same passionate place of having fallen in love with that child and of caring deeply about that child. And instead of rushing in to do better or to take away, to stop and to remind ourselves that person is also in love with that child, and their passion, whether we think it's misguided or not, is very similar to the passion we feel. Now, one of the things I think that fuels the intensity of our feeling to rescue other children or to compete to be the best caregiver for other people's children is that we are all driven to some extent when we care for children by the baby inside of ourselves. That part of our urge to nurture others comes from either the nurturing that we had or the nurturing that we wished that we had. And that's very powerful. But I offer it to you because I think as we become aware of it, it doesn't have to take control over what we do so that we can hold on to our passion. And you all talked about empowering parents. But these are some things I think we need to reflect on in ourselves in order to truly be able to do that. So I look at your faces as I show you the slide, and you're all looking at me in horror, or how could you show us something so painful? How could you do this to us? And I apologize. I do it for a couple of reasons. One is that this child makes the point I just made very strongly, which is that when a child is suffering, again, this child, this is a picture from a textbook from the 1940s. You don't know him, you've never seen this child before. And yet you are feeling for him. And wanting me to do something like switch to the next picture or something. It's intolerable to us to see a child suffer. The other reason is because this child actually is dying of starvation. But he did not stop eating for lack of food, but for lack of love. He was abandoned and put in an orphanage, and in the absence of relationships, shut down, stopped eating. And his immune system, his ability to fight off infections, actually was suppressed. And he succumbed to infection. So attachment, again, is this very powerful biological process. And yet I think it's one that persists throughout life. If you think about all of the children who cross the threshold of the library you work in, there are probably some like him that you remember right away, and you probably even kind of feel warm inside when you think about them. And I would say that there are individual differences in our abilities to attach ourselves, in our attachment behaviors. And in older children, I think they translate, for that matter, adults, parents, into the ability to endear ourselves to someone, the ability to make someone else want to help us or to take care of us. Think about that as the translation throughout life for attachment, and how helpful that is to then have all of the critical elements for learning that you all listed. And how if you are less skilled in this area, less able to make people really care and want to help you, how much harder it will be for you to get into those interpersonal interactions where you are able to learn effectively. So, attachment is perhaps was one of the earliest developmental events that then persists throughout life, which I think is this critical context in which all learning will take place.